Welcome to The Wave, we are Voices of Ecology, a movement powered by the European Union Erasmus Plus program. WAVE brings youth voices to the forefront, from real-life interviews with youth in the Eco-Village movement to exploring the growth in youth perspectives on intergenerational fairness. We are a multi-host podcast where each episode is unique and is hosted by a different WAVE participant. With a rotating format, a diversity of voices, perspectives and passions, WAVE brings them all to the mic. Join us as we dive into bold conversations, share inspiring stories, and explore how we can all live more sustainably.
I would like to ask, given your experience, what unique perspective can youth bring to climate negotiations that older generation might overlook?
First of all, I've met many, older generations who have been really innovative and really, come with great solutions to this process. So this is not only about young people, carrying all the solutions. I think every generation has something to contribute with. What I do see with young people in particular is that they or we are bringing in a quite fresh perspective. So often the young people that are part of our trainings have not been in the process for a long while. They might not have gotten used to this, the informal rules or informal understandings that exist, and they're to question, why should we not talk about fossil fuels? Why should we not talk about compensation for losses and damages? Why should we not, rethink this whole process? There are many curious questions that young people are well posed to bring to this process. Again, it's not, I would imagine that many other people who are not necessarily young could bring this, and I do see that quite often. As I do see as coming new to the process, it might be a bit easier to bring in those perspectives, especially when young people are living with the fear for the future. So basically, young people will live on average longer with the consequences of climate change. And this means that it might feel more urgent to really take action, because it is fundamental about life, both our life, the lives of the people and the modern humans that we care about, that are at stake both in the present and the future.
That is indeed an important observation. I really like your perspective, and so thank you so much for reminding us that each generation brings unique insights and valuable contributions to the table. Therefore, it's really important to have discussions in climate negotiation as inclusive as possible to ensure a fair and sustainable transition of our society for all generations. Given your experience in negotiations as a young person and also your role within the Youth Negotiators Academy, what are the biggest hurdles, challenges young negotiators may encounter when participating in international negotiations, such as COP or UNFCCC sessions, for instance?
There are many barriers. So I would mention 4 at least. The first one is on capacity. So not having had time to build up a capacity, whether it's the knowledge of how the UNFCCC process works. Again, as I said before, it's very complex, or not having had the time to really develop skills in negotiation or the capacity to relate emotionally to this context. So capacity building is a quite big barrier. And I also want to mention that it's not, all youth are not treated equally. So this access to capacity building is very different depending on the country context. So in a country that's, or a community within a country that's is already struggling with crisis of poverty or wars or so on, education might not be an option, unfortunately. So that capacity is a big barrier, and differently so for different parts of the youth demographics. The same goes for a community network. So often it takes time to build up a network of people that are involved in the same context of the UN Climate Convention, and who basically can help you reach solutions by collaborating. So it takes time to build up those networks. So that's also quite a big barrier coming in new to the process, that you might not have had the chance to get to know so many people. And a third barrier, which is quite big and often is not seen, is structural barriers. So how are young people actually regarded within the system? So there might be structures regarding what age do you need to have to be able to get into a certain position, or it might be informal rules. So it might not be explicit that as a young person you're not allowed to be in a country delegation, but it might be implicit that higher age is valued more by whoever is deciding who to have as part of the country delegation to the climate conference. So these informal perceptions or even formal perceptions of young people as not being equally qualified as elders is also quite a big barrier. And a fourth barrier, which becomes very, very clear in the context of the UN Climate Convention, is that of funding, access to resources. So often it's extremely expensive to be able to go to a climate conference. Both the travel there, accommodation, daily expenses, there are so many big expenses where it's hard to cover with personal resources. And even many governments are struggling with actually having a big delegation to these conferences. And this is differentiated between countries that already are very wealthy, which often also have higher emissions and often don't feel the impacts of climate change as strongly. They can often send a larger delegation and thus have a louder voice, so to speak, in the negotiations. Whereas the countries that are feeling the brunt of the consequences, which are already facing an excess of poverty or war and so on, might not be able to send a large delegation. We have seen countries which have maybe one or two delegates, if any, at these conferences. And a large barrier there is specific the funding.
Thank you for sharing current hurdles faced by youth who want to take part in this climate negotiations based on your experience. Indeed, capacity building, consideration of youth, as well as funding and access to resources for youth. How would you define the evolution of the voice of youth and their influence in climate negotiations over the last couple of decades? How do you see it evolving in the future?
So I think there are many ways that young people can have influence. I've seen a large influence from more grassroots movements that are mobilizing. So, for example, the Fridays for Future movement is quite a clear example where millions upon millions of young people demonstrated in the streets, which gained a lot of media visibility. But there are many other grassroots movements that have been focused on specific actions in their countries, whether it's those of indigenous peoples who might also have many young people among them, or so we should not underestimate the pressure and the power of grassroots mobilization, which can influence decisions at the local level, the national level, at the global level. And young people can also influence more within the policy making process. So specifically the UNFCCC, there is a clear division between those who are inside the conference rooms and those who are outside, because they're differentiated by a so-called badge around your neck where it says you have your name, you have the organization that you represent, and this is kind of a clearance to be able to get into the conference. So it's very few young people that actually can get in because of this reason, that they need to have this badge. So those who are actually inside the process often influence it in more subtle ways. So they might have meetings with individual countries trying to get their priorities across, or they might have a statement in the negotiation sessions where they read out, these are the priorities of young people, can you as countries support this? There is one more way that I want to mention. So now I talked about being inside the negotiation rooms, but not necessarily negotiating. But young people can also negotiate, and that's what we are working towards. Basically, young people being part of country delegations, being part of writing the suggestions that countries give to the UN climate process, and being part of actually advocating for those suggestions. So all of these ways are very important, whether it's putting pressure by mobilizing outside the conference venue, or being inside the conference venue as civil society to really put pressure in more subtle ways there, or actually being a negotiator, where you really push forward for specific suggestions relating to the decision-making process. So many ways.
Thank you for giving us so many examples of ways that youth can use to make their voice heard. Looking a little bit more into current practices to ensure addressing intergenerational equity in negotiations, what tools or frameworks do you recommend to analyze intergenerational equity across geographies?
What we do as the Youth Negotiators Academy to, within our own organization, promote this concept of intergenerational equity, or rather as we use it, intergenerational collaboration, is that we have a so-called wisdom council. So it's made up of, let's say, senior experts who have often decades of experience in the topics that are dealt with in the UN Climate Convention. And they advise us, they provide their knowledge of how we might work towards our mission most effectively, inclusively, and so on. So we do have a continuous dialogue between the young people that are part of our training, ourselves as a relatively young team, and also more senior experts and practitioners, either from the Wisdom Council or others that we are collaborating with. So that's something we try to do, to have these continuous dialogues with actors of any generation, to make sure that we're not talking just among young people. We are actively having fora where young people can share their reflections with elder people and vice versa. So that's one concrete tool, to have basically wisdom councils or similar structures for youth-led initiatives. In terms of basically how it can be implemented within the negotiations, one concrete practice is to have young people as part of your delegations. And when I say young people, that also includes children. There might be ways to explore, how would you represent children's interest, or actually have children present through your delegation, to make sure that it's not only about taking into account the interests of young people, because young people should actually be there and talk about their interests themselves, rather than someone else having the potentially well-intentioned role to represent those interests. But in practice, often that does not lead to young people's interest being protected to the same extent as if young people are actually at the decision-making table. So I think those are two key practices. One, to have fora which are intergenerational in nature, and secondly, to have young people as part of the decision-making delegations in the context of the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Convention.
These are really interesting examples of practices to ensure intergenerational equity, to make decision-making processes as inclusive as possible, and foster exchanges of ideas and needs across generations. Thank you. In light of these aspects, may I ask you if you can name one elder whose climate wisdom shaped you and inspired you to pursue your journey in climate negotiations?
Me personally, what comes to mind is Mary Robinson, who was former, let's see if I get this right, President, I think, of Ireland, and also previous UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. And I was in a session that was organized through the Climate Youth Negotiator program when I was actually a participant myself. And I remember that I had this burning question about how do we bring in the topic of climate refugees into this process? Because I feel like that's such a clear intersection between human rights and climate change, and how basically those who are already most vulnerable are facing the worst consequences. So when I asked this question to Mary Robinson, the words she said still stick in my mind. It was, "I commend you as a young man And it felt just so empowering to hear that, I'm not alone with these thoughts. I'm not alone in thinking that, you really need to stand up for those who are the most affected by the crisis of climate change, by the crisis of biodiversity loss, and the intersecting environmental and social challenges that we're facing. So that inspired me. That made me feel like, yes, it's worth continuing to fight, even when it's a struggle to even get to the conference in the first place.
Thank you for sharing this personal anecdote that shaped your journey so far and fueled your motivation, let's say, in taking your steps into the world of international climate negotiations. Moving towards the call to action message that we would like to deliver to our audience, especially youth, through this conversation. You previously mentioned the skills and competences that you aim to provide to young people joining your academy and willing to play a role in climate negotiations, and you perfectly described the complexity of the set of hard and soft skills required. What do you think is needed to become a youth climate negotiator beyond the skills, I mean? What are the underlying passions, motivations needed as starting points?
I believe you're touching on a very important point, which is that to be an effective and, compassionate negotiator in this process, what matters is not necessarily to have many years of experience, capacity, and networks and so on. It starts with values. It starts with having a cause that you are very passionate about. So whether it is that you have seen the impacts of climate change or biodiversity loss or pollution in your local community, and you feel that it is so unfair that this is happening, that in itself can be a strong motivation. So my encouragement is that if you are feeling passionate about the issue, if you're feeling that, I want to be part of addressing this, you have already come a long way. What organizations such as ours are trying to do is to welcome people who have that passion, who really have a mission that they want to work towards, and provide the conditions to be able to do so. But what's important is to have that motivation in the first place, because if you have that motivation, you can go through the whole training program that we have. You can make the most out of it and really get those skills, that knowledge, the networks, and be present in the decision-making spaces. So I really encourage you to don't underestimate the power of passion and having a clear mission. So that would be my call to action. If you want to become a young decision maker, it starts with passion.
Thank you so much for sharing your view and really providing valuable advice and to inspire youth to take action starting from their local communities. Maybe while slowly starting to conclude our conversation, based on your experience, can you provide one myth about youth and climate policy and climate negotiations you'd love to debunk forever?
Well, I think one myth that is quite common is that young people are requiring that others are doing the job for them, that young people are requiring that, you older generations, you should clean up the mess. To some extent, this is true. But what I more often see is that young people are not waiting for other generations to do it, because we are valuing the future, we are valuing the present, and we want to contribute to a better present and future as long as we have the conditions to do so. So the myth that I want to debunk is that young people are only demanding. We are also actively implementing.
Thank you for redefining the role of youth and highlighting what they can do and expect. Thank you also for navigating us through the complexity of climate negotiations and the related opportunities for youth to take part in these dialogues. You also touched on the challenges that youth may face when engaging in these dialogues, negotiations. What is one main key takeaway you would like our listeners to remember from this conversation?
The first main takeaway I would say is that it's all connected. Several times touched upon this aspect of that the climate impacts are often the worst in communities which are already vulnerable. And this goes both from social crises such as conflicts or poverty, also goes for other environmental crises. So in a place which has lost large parts of its nature, for example, forests have been cut down or similar, often the communities are less resilient to subsequent climate impacts. So to be able to really address these issues, we need joint solutions. That's why we as the Youth Negotiators Academy talk about environmental justice. We don't talk about only climate justice. So that's one key point, that we need to address the issues at the root. So while we have today addressed mainly the climate youth negotiator program that we actually have one other program that we have already implemented, another one that's planned. So the first one is the land youth negotiator program, which deals with land issues like desertification, land degradation. And the other one, which we are yet to implement, is the biodiversity youth negotiator program, which deals with the UN Biodiversity Convention. And this is because we see these issues as fundamentally interconnected, needing to be addressed together. And the second key message I want to leave with is that for any type of action to be long-term sustainable, basically that it lasts in the long term, we need to include those who are the most affected. Whether it is the local communities that are affected, often indigenous communities, or whether it is the young people, even the future generations that will bear the longest time of consequences. The most marginalized group, the ones that will be the most affected, need to be at the decision-making table. Otherwise, these solutions won't last. And then the third key message I want to leave you with is that of ambition and stubborn optimism. So even though the situation might seem very dire, even though it seems like every potential trend of the environment is going in the wrong direction, it is still worth fighting. It is still worth believing that the future can be at least a bit better. So what I want to leave you with is that being ambitious is not a matter of, either you make the final goal or not. It's about making a difference here and now by trying as much as we can to save lives, to avoid the worst consequences. For me, working in the Youth Negotiators Academy, that's such a privilege to be able to directly be there to support and make a difference in people's lives. So many of the participants of our training, it's the first time they actually can go to a climate conference. It's the first time that they feel like their voices are being heard in that space. And for me, that's worth fighting for.
This is indeed really inspiring. So considering environmental justice as well as inclusivity, leaving no one behind, looking at long-term solutions, and last but certainly not least, being ambitious and holding to hope to make a change. One future hope you hold on to?
What I hope for is that we won't have to have a Youth Negotiators Academy. It will be obvious that young people are at the decision-making table. We could have just a Negotiators Academy that basically trains people on an equitable level to really make a difference. So my hope is really that it won't remain a question whether we should have young people as part of the process or not. It will just be a matter of doing it.
So, as we come to the end of our podcast, I want to thank you once again, Axel, for joining us today. Our conversation was truly inspiring, I believe. Thank you so much for presenting different opportunities where youth can take action in climate negotiations. I wish you all the best in your future endeavors, especially with the Youth Negotiators Academy. To all our listeners, thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. Please feel free to share this episode if you find it useful and interesting, and we'll see each other in the next one. Bye!
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Wave podcast. We are Voices of Ecology. Stay tuned and subscribed so you don't miss out on the next episodes. If you are inspired to act, share and learn more, connect with us. Follow us on Instagram at waveprojecteu. And share the episode with another person today. Every beat helps keep the wave moving forward.